In this session, we're going to talk about Nerdio for Azure and Azure Active Directory, Azure AD Connect, and various password synchronization and authentication methods, a foundational topic in building a successful cloud practice in Microsoft Azure. This video picks up from the discussion we had in the previous session on Office 365, so make sure to spend some time reviewing that one as well. Enjoy the session.
Today we're going to continue talking about Azure Active Directory, Azure AD Connect, and various password synchronization and authentication methods. It's somewhat complex and involved. I'm going to do a whiteboard session in a few minutes to try to kind of draw out what those flows are. But again, just sort of recap, Microsoft for identity management uses Azure AD, which underpins all of the Microsoft cloud services. We'll use Office 365 as a specific example. You have Azure AD Connect, which is a tool that's primarily designed for synchronizing user objects from an existing Active Directory environment into an Azure AD environment, which then allows you to assign Office 365 services to that user object. And the way that those users authenticate really depends on the configuration. So with Azure AD Connect specifically, there are different ways to install it and configure it. When you install it, there is a express setup, which is sort of the default. And then there's lots of different ways to customize that installation. At the current time, AD Connect can only be installed from a GUI, from a UI, and it cannot be installed through command line, as far as we know. Hopefully that's going to change sometime in the near future, and that will give us more flexibility when we deploy Nerdio and we deploy NFA accounts on how to pre-configure them. So today, the way we pre-configure them with ADFS has to do with sort of what the limitations are of how AD Connect can be set up and configured via programmatically as opposed to at the UI. AD Connect also used to be known as dir sync or directory synchronization. So if you'll see some old references to dir sync, that's the same thing as the AD Connect tool. Just to show you in the Nerdio context, we looked at this yesterday, but let's look at it one more time. We have the user section. Every user account that's listed in this section is inside of the Nerdio Active Directory on a server called DCO1 that you can see under servers. And then DCO1 is where Azure AD Connect runs and does its synchronization. And once it does its synchronization, it matches up user accounts that exist in Active Directory and either creates new counterparts for those user accounts or matches them with existing counterparts. Licenses are then, Office 365 licenses and services are then assigned to the objects in Azure AD, and those objects have a pair and a source in a Active Directory existing object that is being synchronized by Azure AD. Okay, so let's talk about the different methods for authentication. And if you think about it, let me open up a whiteboard here. Okay. So if you think about it, authentication happens, a prerequisite for authentication is that the password be available for the authentication to happen. So there is the username and all the user object properties, but the most important component is the password so that when someone goes in and types in their password into an authentication form, it can be validated that that is in fact the password that belongs to that user object. So let's look at it like this. So let's say you have an existing AD environment, and let's say there's a DC01 that is the domain controller for that environment. You then have your cloud environment here, and part of it is Azure AD. And then there's Office 365 and various other services that are in the cloud environment, right? So this is the cloud. So you have a user that's sitting on, on a laptop or a desktop, whatever, and is coming in to a login page that is in the Microsoft Cloud. They get prompted with an authentication form that asks them for the username and password. And if you've noticed, Microsoft recently changed this. When you type in the username, it actually doesn't ask you for the password right away. It asks you for the username first. And the reason it does that is because based on the username, it determines where the authentication is actually going to happen. So user comes in, they type in their username, and then Azure Active Directory will know based on the domain of that username, right, the domain portion of what they typed in, there is going to be a different way to authenticate that user. So in our case, let's say with the default Nerdio deployment, what happens is there is an ADFS role, which stands for Active Directory Federation Services. There's basically a service running on top of this DC01. There happens to be a proxy server that's sitting in the DMZ out here. These two are connected via HTTPS. They communicate over from LAN to DMZ. So when the user comes in to any of the Microsoft properties, Office 365 specifically in this case, they type in their credentials. Azure AD determines that the domain is actually one that is federated, right? So that's the term, the domain is federated, which means Office 365 will not be handling the validation of that password, and instead it passes through that authentication to ADFS like that. And then the user actually gets another login screen that looks slightly different. You've noticed there's like a blue side here. It says Nerdio up here. They type in, usually it passes through their username, but their password they have to enter. Once they type in the password, it gets validated with the domain right here. And then once it's validated, then an authentication token is passed back to Active Directory in Azure, telling Azure that this particular user is authorized to access whatever the resource is, right? So Active Directory, Azure Active Directory passes through or federates that authentication request to the ADFS that it's pointing at, and then ADFS validates that the password is right, and then it passes an authentication token back, allowing access to those resources. Now, the important ramification to keep in mind is you have a few components here that it relies on. You need to make sure the domain controller is up. You need to make sure the ADFS service is up. You need to make sure that the proxy server, that is the publicly facing proxy server that intercepts and tunnels these connections, is up. And then you need to make sure there's networking and internet connectivity in this whole thing is properly configured so that these authentication requests can come through. If, let's say, this thing is down, if let's say the proxy server is down, what's going to happen is you'll just get a page cannot be displayed, and the user will not be able to authenticate with their Office 365 services. Now, once the authentication happens, a mobile device, for example, like an iPhone or an Android device, will get a token that's going to have a certain amount of lifetime. It's not going to require authentication each and every time. So even if this becomes unavailable, this ADFS infrastructure becomes unavailable for a short amount of time, that token will still be valid, and they will be able to get their email, for instance. But if it's down long enough, I don't know exactly what the expiry time is, but that token will expire, and then the users will not be able to get into their email until they're able to get through and be authenticated again. What are the advantages of doing it this way? Well, the advantages of doing it this way is that you have a single source of authentication information. It's in the Active Directory. All the authentication happens in Active Directory through ADFS. You have what's called single sign-on enabled, which means that anybody who's part of this Active Directory within, the DC01's network environment, when they open up Office or Word or Outlook, for example, it uses single sign-on where it will automatically sign them into their SharePoint and into their OneDrive, and it will activate the license if they have that assigned. So it just makes the user experience a little bit more seamless. And it also is sort of an instant, if you disable a user or you change a password, because the only place that password exists is here, right, in Active Directory, it will be instant. So if you disable a user and then that same user tries to authenticate, they will be denied immediately because you'll be authenticating them against the Active Directory, which is where you would have disabled their account. Okay, so this is the ADFS authentication mechanism, which is the default for any newly provisioned Nerdio environments with the domain that has this format, right? So it's the account id.nerdio.net, which is the default domain that comes with every Nerdio deployment. So any user accounts at this domain will be authenticated with ADFS by default, which means this domain is federated. Let's look at another scenario. Again, a more typical non-Nerdio type scenario. So again, we have our cloud up here. Okay, so this is our cloud. We have our Azure AD and Office 365 in here. You have a user, that's coming in and is getting a prompt for username and password. Now imagine for a moment there isn't an existing Active Directory in place. So what happens? You have an in-cloud user object that lives in this environment. This in-cloud user object has both the user, schema, the user information, the name, the group membership, all the Office 365 licenses, etc. And it also has the password because it was created inside of Office 365 and Azure AD. So it's a native object. There's no AD involved. The user goes in, gets a login prompt. There's an authentication token that gets sent back to whatever device that's requesting authentication, and access to resources is granted, right? So this is really nice and clean and simple. In this scenario, the domain, it may be whatever company, .com. This domain is known as managed. A managed domain is one that is managed by Office 365 or by Azure AD more precisely. So a managed domain is sort of the default deployment of an Office 365 environment, and that's how that works. Okay, again, very clean and simple. No existing infrastructure that you need to rely on for authentication purposes. All right, now let's look at another scenario. The other scenario is we have a new Nerdio customer, and sorry, one second. There we go. And this new customer has an AD deployment that's, so let's call it, AD1. And they are migrating to Nerdio, right? So this is going to be the new DC01. So we talked yesterday that initially there's synchronization that's happening here. And then we basically want to break this and we want to start synchronizing here while retaining all the data that's inside of Office 365, okay? So now, when the customer provisions, or when the partner on behalf of the customer provisions the initial environment, the domain that is already part of Office 365 is not federated. 95% of the time, if not 100% of the time, people are not coming in with domains that are already federated, means the authentication is handed off to some other infrastructure. In most cases, that domain is managed. And then once we swing this authentication over from, AD1 and we get rid of it, right? So this eventually goes away. Now you have everything being synced from here. You still have a managed domain that lives in Office 365. And what AD Connect is doing, again, this is the default setting of AD Connect, is it's doing a password hash sync, okay? So password hash sync is a one-directional synchronization of a password hash that's generated on DC01. So let's say there's a user called John Smith, and that user has a password. So AD Connect will calculate a one-directional hash, meaning that and then it will store it in Azure AD associated with that user object. So when a user comes in and tries to authenticate, when they type in the password, they use a one-way hashing algorithm of whatever they typed. They compare it to whatever is stored inside of Azure AD. If that matches, that obviously authenticates the user. If it doesn't match, it obviously doesn't authenticate the user. So there isn't any real-time communication with the domain, with DC01 specifically, during the authentication process. But the way the password gets derived is from what it is in Active Directory. So on a scheduled basis, AD Connect runs usually every 30 minutes by default. And it will synchronize any passwords that have changed on the local Active Directory, or in this case, the Nerdio Active Directory, to the password hash inside of Azure AD, but it will not participate in the authentication process. It will only pre-populate what those hashes are. The reason it's a one-way hash is there is, technically no way to take that hash and derive from it what the original password was. You can only compare it to something else that gets hashed from a password that's typed in, and just to see if they match, but there's no way to go the other way, which means that you cannot change the password in Office 365, at least kind of if everything is working right. If you were able to change it, first of all, what would happen is AD Connect would override it the next time it runs if password hash sync is enabled. They would get out of sync if you were able to do that. So that's again a very common scenario. Password hash sync is enabled. Authentication happens inside of Azure Active Directory, but DC01 and the domain controller, or whatever the Azure AD Connect, determines what that password is. Let's talk about two additional scenarios. Scenario number one is AD Connect is used primarily to synchronize user objects and optionally to synchronize the password hashes, okay? So these password hashes get synchronized only if that's what's enabled. I think that's the default setting, especially if you do the express setup, that does get enabled. However, it's not mandatory. So what that means is you could have AD Connect synchronizing user objects, but not synchronizing passwords. What that would lead to is a scenario where you have a set of passwords here, right? So there would be, one password here, and there would be another set of passwords here. The usernames and email addresses would be the same, but the passwords would not necessarily be in sync. Now, it's a bit of a pain for the users, but it's important to know that that is possible in sort of migration scenarios when, let's say, you have a bunch of users that are already connecting all of their mobile devices to Office 365, and you don't want to override all of their passwords with an AD Connect synchronization all at the same time. So what you could do is you could disable that synchronization, and then maybe do a planned cutover where you do enable it. It resets all of the passwords, and then all the users know how to go in and reconfigure their individual devices for the various settings. Okay, so it is possible, and it's important to know. The third The third mechanism, so we talked about password hash sync, where the authentication is happening in in Azure AD and Office 365, and not on-prem. And then we talked about ADFS, where the authentication is being forwarded to the domain controller via ADFS. The third method, which is the newest one, is called pass-through authentication. And pass-through authentication has kind of the best of both worlds. Well, let's talk about just the advantages. We talked about the advantages of ADFS and some of the risks, right? The risks are it needs to be available, and if it's not available, you can't authenticate. The advantages are it enables single sign-on, and the same password is consistent throughout, and there's no lag between making changes to the user accounts. The advantages of authenticating inside of the Azure AD environment is that you're not relying on the local infrastructure, which means if the local infrastructure is unavailable or you decide to commission it one day, you don't need to rely on it. The disadvantages are you have a lag in synchronization and you don't necessarily have that single sign-on experience, right? So the advantages of one are the disadvantages of the other. So the thing that I wanted to show you is this thing called pass-through authentication. And pass-through authentication is a way of authenticating connections as follows. Okay, so AD pass-through authentication works like this. You have an agent called the pass-through authentication agent that runs inside of the Active Directory that's on-prem or a Nerdio or whatever. It basically services the requests in real time as if it is ADFS. So a user comes in, right? So a user signs into the Microsoft Azure Active Directory. From there, there is a authentication request that's placed in a queue, which is picked up fairly quickly by this pass-through agent, which is running inside of the Windows Active Directory environment. It picks up that request. It compares it against the local Active Directory database, and then it returns a token back to Azure Active Directory saying whether to allow or deny this user access into the environment, right? So what's happening here? What's happening here is we do not have ADFS infrastructure at all, right? And ADFS can get complex. You need a proxy server, you need ADFS service. You also need to open external connectivity into your network. In this case, you don't need any of that. This agent can run on one or more servers inside of the environment. So it could have sort of built-in redundancy. You can have 2, 3, 4, 5 of them running, and any one of them can service a request. It does not need to be open to the internet. So you don't need, the user doesn't get redirected to a particular URL, which is then served up through an ADFS proxy and then logs in on that page. The user is serviced in Azure AD, and everything's happening on the back end through a queuing system. The user does get single sign-on benefits, and there is no lag in synchronization of passwords because those passwords are being validated on the Active Directory environment, not in Azure AD where they have to be synced. Okay. Now, in addition to this, you could continue synchronizing those passwords. So if at some point you wanted to change authentication methodology, you still have a backup of those passwords saved in Azure AD. Now, they're not ever being accessed because all authentication requests are passed through to this agent, which compares them to the original Active Directory, but they are still in Azure AD because they are being synchronized. Okay, so this is called pass-through authentication. It is something that you need to enable on the Azure AD tenant, and it's something that needs to be enabled in AD Connect. And then you obviously need to install these pass-through agents, which are pretty light. The challenge with all of this today is that none of this is programmatically possible, and you can only set this up after the environment is provisioned and kind of do all of this stuff manually. Hopefully, when it all becomes programmatically possible, this is probably the most lightweight and most functional and most redundant way of doing authentication. And once we can do it programmatically, we're going to make that, I presume, be the default in a new Nerdio deployment. And then we're going to make ADFS as an option, sort of as a secondary option. Let me illustrate, and I mean, most of you will know this, but let me illustrate a federated sign-on versus a managed domain sign-on. So first, let me show you in the NAP. If we go under domains, okay, you'll notice that a domain will be labeled either as federated, or once it's verified, it will say managed. And the federated domain means that Microsoft has been told, Azure AD has been told that anytime an authentication request comes in with this in the domain field, there is a URL you are to forward that request to. So if we take, an environment like this and we say, sign out and sign in as someone else. Back. Okay, so let's say we're going to sign in with a non-federated domain. So this Adara IT is non-federated. So let's go ahead, click there. We're going to say it's a work and school account. And boom, right away, I'm getting a password prompt. And if you notice where I am still on microsoftonline.com, right? So I'm kind of in the same place where I started. I wasn't redirected anywhere else. Now, on the other hand, if I say, test at getnerdio.com, getnerdio is a federated domain. So as soon as I click next, you'll see it's taking you to the organization sign-in page, and it has now redirected me to this host, which is actually a VM. That's the proxy, ADFS proxy in the Nerdio environment. I am then going to type in my credentials. I'm going to click sign in. This will validate it against Active Directory via that HTTPS tunnel, and it's going to deny it. If I were to type in a valid password, then I would be redirected back to Microsoft Online to complete the sign-in experience. Okay, I'm going to cover a couple more things here. I'm going to talk about multi-factor authentication, and let's talk about multi-factor authentication and how to get support. So let's get the getting support out of the way first. Same concept as with Azure. If it's a CSP account, you submit a support request via the partner, by logging into the Office 365 tenant through the Partner Center account, right? So if you log in as your Partner Center user, then drill down to the individual customer, go to management services, click on Office 365, then go into support, then open a ticket. It's going to properly open the ticket with the right level of priority. If you have a CSP subscription and you try to do that as the customer or as a login that's not a Partner Center login, it's not going to allow you. It's going to tell you contact your CSP provider. But if you are in any other type of a subscription, if it's a direct subscription or a different type of one, then you may be able to submit that help ticket. Okay, so let's talk about multi-factor authentication in Office 365. So in Office 365, let's say, let's do this. So what you'll notice here is it's going to go to my second factor. Let me pull up my phone, type that in. Okay. Okay, so what you note here is that prompt came on the microsoftonline.com screen rather than on the Nerdio screen. So the authentication flow is you go to Microsoft Online, it validates your domain, it figures out where your authentication, your password confirmation should happen, sends you back to ADFS proxy. Then ADFS proxy validates that you're a valid user and then sends you back to Microsoft Online. Microsoft Online then checks whether or not you have multi-factor enabled. And if you have multi-factor enabled, it's going to challenge you at that point, right? So it's It's username, then redirection for password validation, then back to Azure AD for multi-factor. So the way multi-factor works is like this. You can go to manage multi-factor authentication right here. And multi-factor authentication in Office 365 is enabled for any Office 365 Azure AD tenant. So even though if you don't have Office 365, it's a paid service if you wanted multi-factor. But with Office 365, for sure, with all of the enterprise plans, I think all the business premium plans as well. I don't know if there are some Office 365 SKUs that don't include it, but for the most part, they do. Now, let me show you what are the options. So there are two options that you can have. You can either have it disabled, you can enable it, or you can enforce it. Okay. So when multi-factor is enabled, that means that the user, the next time they log into their Office 365 portal, they will be taken on the sort of the activation process for MFA. They'll be asked for phone numbers, confirmation, it will text them things, right? Set up various second factor methodologies. And then once they go through that process, the status will change to enforced. And in enforced status, every time you interact with Azure AD or any of the Microsoft services that sit on top of it, you need to provide second factor. So until they go through the enrollment process, they will stay in enabled. And once they go through the enrollment process, they will become enforced. Once they're enforced, in order to use applications that do not have a web interface, maybe like a mail app or something like that on the iPhone, there's a way to generate what's called app passwords, like one-time use passwords for specific applications. You know, we're not going to go through that right now, but I'm sure most of you know how that works. But the other thing I wanted to mention is it's possible to set a user, instead of being enabled for multi-factor, you can set the user to be enforced right away, which means they will have to go to the web interface and enroll themselves. And if they don't, then all of their existing devices will stop working, right? So if you set them to enabled, it's not going to force them to do it, and it will prompt them to do it the next time they go in. But let's say their mobile device will keep working. If you set them to enforced, then they're going to be forced to enroll, and until they do, they won't be able to communicate with their services.